Also, thank you for attending the last session of this first day of the conference. And it's, as you may know, I'm not Jamilja. She couldn't attend, so I'm Dominic also from EDF. And I was also moderator this morning, so I'm used to the job. So we will start for first presentation, Tim from the Fraunhofer Institute. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. For those 5 of you who do not know me yet, 6 of you, 7. My name is Tim Mandl. I'm a researcher at Fraunhofer ISI in Karlsruhe, Germany, mostly involved with issues of energy policy and energy markets, with a particular focus on the building sector. And besides that, I'm dedicating my PhD thesis to the topic of energy efficiency first, which has been kind of buzzword that has been around for a couple of years now in the EU debate. So in this talk today, I would like to shed some light on these 2 kind of separate but kind of interlinked concepts of energy efficiency first and multiple impacts. So both of these terms have been around in the debate for a couple of years by now. Sometimes they tend to be used as buzzwords. People often say, okay, energy efficiency needs to be like the first fuel and it brings so many multiple benefits and multiple impacts, and that's why we have to go for it. But there's a little bit more to that, as I'll be showing in my presentation today. My structure, if you will, is quite straightforward. So there's the first part in which I will be briefly talking about these 2 theoretical notions of energy efficiency first and multiple impacts, like why do they belong together? What are they all about? Are they modern buzzwords? Indeed. And then the second part, I will provide some limited but still interesting quantitative evidence on the possible role of multiple impacts in a model-based analysis for the EU 27. So to go ahead with, some of you may have stumbled across the official definition of energy efficiency first in the EU governance regulation of 2018. However, the definition is super bulky and it's not really worth recapping here. So that's why we came up with this a little bit more illustrative charts in the NFIRST project, which I should have mentioned in the first place. This research was funded by the Horizon 2020 project NFIRST, which has been running from 2019 till July of this year. But back to the slide. So what we see here is what the energy efficiency first principle is basically about. So for one thing, it's not solely about comparing pears and apples, but about always having kind of a common functional unit or common decision objectives, as we call it here. So ideally, you would have, for example, a common greenhouse gas reduction target. And then in the second step, and this is a crucial aspect of efficiency first of the concept, you compare different so-called resource options, which can be supply-side resources and demand-side resources. And finally, there's this decision rule inherent to energy efficiency first, which says that these demand-side resources, including demand response, end-use energy efficiency, energy sufficiency, etc., should be prioritized whenever these provide greater value to society or whenever these are more cost-efficient in meeting these stated objectives than supply-side resources. So this is basically the whole story about energy efficiency first. In theory, implementing or making the principle a reality is quite straightforward. Like if I was a central benevolent planner who had all the strings in my hand, I would just select those demand side or those resource options overall that would minimize cost or maximize welfare or anything like that. And that would be basically it. But however, as we all know, we live in a market economy in the EU. Things are not that easy. We have an awful lot of decentralized actors who act on their own interest. We have regulated actors. We have actors that work in a market-based environment and so on. So that makes the implementation of this principle super difficult in practice. And that's one of the instances where the NFIRST project came into play. That's so much for a moment about energy efficiency first. Let's look at the idea of multiple impacts. I suppose all of you are aware of this flower chart that the IEA came up with, and it's by now infamous multiple benefits report of 2015, 2016. What is what is quite interesting is that by now there's no universally recognized definition of multiple benefits or multiple impacts, even though the term is used quite frequently. Here on the right-hand side, you see a definition that we took from a journal paper that emerged from the COMBI project from 2016, which says that multiple benefits or multiple impacts, as they are called here in a more neutral way, are all benefits and costs, which are not direct private benefits or costs involving a financial transaction. So it's all these diffuse impacts that you cannot immediately put a price tag on in cost-benefit analysis. So that's the idea of multiple impacts. As I said before, energy efficiency first is basically saying that a kilowatt hour generated is equivalent to a kilowatt hour saved. So if we want to solve this trade-off in the best way, we need a fair comparison of demand and supply side resources. Traditionally, this has been done by means of simply financial costs or energy system costs overall, which, as many argue, leads to a biased result in a way that the value of especially demand side resources and energy efficiency in particular is undervalued. And that's why integrating these multiple impacts is so critical when it comes to making the energy efficiency first principle a reality. However, as I just touched upon before, implementing the principle is more difficult than one may assume in the first place, because in some instances we might have direct leverage to really prioritize demand side resources whenever these are more beneficial, such as network planning, which is in the EU and I suppose globally subject to regulation, and that's why the regulatory authorities have some power or some limited power even about how investments are made. But then things are getting more difficult already when we talk about actors in a market-based environment, such as generators in power market. But basically, when we stick to let me go to a different slide first. When we stick to these kind of regulated environments that are also subject to planning, there are a couple of instances then that one might think of where integrating multiple impacts is super critical. Here's a rough selection. There's many more. One very critical example are the European Commission's impact assessments, which have been involving some form of multiple impacts, even though they may not have labeled them as such, but which already to some extent incorporates the idea that there's more than financial cost and benefits. In the Commission's proposal for a recast of the Energy Efficiency Directive, there's the idea of municipal heat planning, which has been practiced already in countries such as Denmark, which is gaining some relevance in Germany, for example, but which apparently now is going to have a bigger role to play in the recast EED. I already touched upon power and gas transmission network planning. We have these comprehensive assessments of heating and cooling in Article 14 of the EED, public procurement, design of building codes, and much more. So these are all instances where factoring in multiple impacts can really make a difference in comparing different resource options. However, there's still a little discrepancy, let's say, between ambition and practical challenges. On the one hand, there's this ambition, particularly in the Commission's proposal for the EED recast, which now features a very prominent Article 3 on energy efficiency, on energy efficiency first, and which explicitly says that these wider benefits or multiple impacts or whatever you want to call them need to be properly included in cost-benefit methodologies whenever planning or major investment decisions are being made. There are also the Commission's official recommendation on energy efficiency first, which basically says the same thing. Whenever we talk about strategic decisions, regulatory frameworks, future investment schemes, we need to take into account the full societal and private value of energy efficiency. However, in turn, there are these ongoing practical challenges, even though there's been quite a bit of research already on multiple impacts in general. Maybe what has been addressed already is how to quantify different multiple impacts. There are now several ongoing, for example, Horizon research projects, such as the MICAT project, who are giving more emphasis to individual multiple impacts and how they can be possibly quantified in physical terms. But then the next challenge is when we talk about energy efficiency first, how do we bring them together in order to really inform decision making? So let's say that I have a whole bunch of financial numbers. I have like 10 different indicators for multiple impacts. That still doesn't enable me to make an informed decision on whether this or that option is the one to actually prefer. And this raises this practical challenge of aggregating multiple impacts. The most, or what the Commission most seems to be thinking about most when it comes to aggregating multiple impacts is cost-benefits analysis. So that means we quantify multiple impacts and we monetize them, and this allows us to aggregate them in a single monetary metric. But those of you who have been involved with cost-benefit analysis for CBA know that this is pretty challenging in practice. We have many multiple impacts for which quantitative evidence is missing. We have ethical concerns that surround monetization. Do we want to put a cost number on human lives or not? These are questions that naturally arise in that process. So that's why, especially this latter point right here of aggregating multiple impacts is super challenging in the context of energy efficiency first. So how do we deal with that? Basically, when we go through all different tools we have, we sooner or later get to these two concepts of cost-benefit analysis on the one hand and multi-criteria analysis on the other. I just said a few words about cost-benefit analysis. So we take these indicators, we monetize them, we aggregate them, and voila. But then in turn, we have multi-criteria analysis, which allows us to accommodate both qualitative and quantitative indicators, which don't necessarily need to be in the same monetary units. So at a first look, MCA looks super compelling because we can accommodate all these diffuse multiple impacts. However, there are obviously a couple of practical challenges to both concepts, which doesn't make the whole thing easier. As we summarized in this table right here, I'm not going to go through each and every line. Sorry. But basically, as you can imagine, the whole challenge about CBA is to have robust methods for really quantifying and monetizing multiple impacts. There's the ongoing dispute about discount rates, which doesn't seem to find an end, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas for multi-criteria analysis, I believe that the biggest challenge is if you really want to make this whole thing representative and really include stakeholder views, you need to have a very broad stakeholder involvement process, which is obviously very, very time and resource intensive, depending on the context. If we were to talk about an EU-wide assessment that is supposed to replace EU impact assessments as they're being dealt with now, I think it's quite, or it would be wishful thinking to have a comprehensive inclusion of EU-wide stakeholders that would kind of be representative of the public overall. So in the end, we're kind of stuck with these two concepts, CBA and MCA. There's also a couple of indicator-based approaches that we touch upon in the corresponding and the first report, but it basically comes down to this. So what do we do about that? Now it's switching. Okay. So basically, what we tried in this part of the NF1 project, aside from dealing with these theoretical and conceptual aspects, is to provide some further quantitative evidence on the role of multiple impacts in the focus of the energy efficiency first principle. So you see this report here on the right-hand side, which is telling this whole story in a much more comprehensive way. But basically, what we try to investigate is to pinpoint the exact, or not the, cannot be exact about this, but to pinpoint the overall value of end-use energy efficiency in the building sector for the EU to transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So what's often done in the energy efficiency context is that we have a baseline scenario and then an energy efficiency scenario, which then, of course, leads to huge values for multiple impacts if you compare this pessimistic with an optimistic future. But we wanted to know what happens if we take this 2050 target of net zero emissions for granted and then see about the added value that energy efficiency in the building sector can bring in terms of reducing system costs, but also with regard to multiple impacts. Here on the left-hand side, you see a couple of charts, which are definitely not exhaustive of the report overall. basically what we came up with is a range of 3 scenarios, which are labeled as low F, medium F, and high F, standing for low efficiency to high efficiency, basically. Each of these scenarios is geared to reach a 2050 target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions for the EU overall. However, the ambition level for energy efficiency in the building sector is slightly different for the 3 scenarios. This different ambition for energy efficiency, so including building retrofits, but also including efficient electrical appliances, then has implication for the magnitude of supply side capacities that are needed in order to reach the 2050 net zero target. This is what we see on the bottom left-hand side on the slide. If we were to go for the high efficiency scenario, we need, for example, much less wind and photovoltaics capacity by 2050 in order to reach this 2050 target. The same goes for, which you can see on the very bottom left chart, for cross-border electrical transmission capacities across the EU. So this, to some extent, already provides a somewhat clear case for the energy efficiency first scenario. So if we can avoid supply side or redundant supply side resources by means of energy efficiency, then this is a good thing in itself. But like this is one way you could put it, but you could also look at this from a more quantitative side, as I'll be showing in the next slide. But before I move on, I just want to emphasize that even what is labeled here as low efficiency scenario is much more ambitious than the business as usual scenarios, which are, for example, provided by the EU reference scenario. To put a finger on it, the low efficiency scenario by 2050 in the building sector reduces final energy consumption by about 25%, whereas the EU reference scenario is at a reduction of about 10% compared to today's levels. So even in what was kind of mistakenly labeled here as low efficiency scenario, we're already much beyond the current ambition, because otherwise, based on these optimization models that we applied here, we wouldn't even be able to reach the 2050 targets. So much about that. Let's look at some cost and multiple impact numbers. What we did in the dedicated report in the first project is to provide some selected quantitative evidence on 2 categories, if you will, of multiple impacts. One being air pollution impacts, and the other one being indoor comfort gains as a result of thermal retrofitting. What we see here is the excuse me, are the numbers for air pollution impacts. So the overall story is as follows. So we have this 2050 net zero greenhouse gas emissions target, which is set across the scenarios. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that air pollution reductions are always going in the same direction. This is because the scenarios differ in terms of the use of bioenergy carriers, but also in terms of synthetic combustibles, such as hydrogen and synthetic methane and others. So this leads, even though we have this 2050 greenhouse gas target, this leads to some slight deviations in terms of the air pollution emissions that arise over the period from today until 2050. And here on the left-hand side is basically one of the key charts of this report, which indicates the overall additional costs that arise because of building retrofits and electrical appliances. The font size is a little small, but I'm gonna walk you through it. So we have these additional costs that arise because of building retrofits and electrical appliances. But then in turn, we have these savings for heating systems, for district heating generation, district heating networks, electricity generation, electricity networks, hydrogen, and also to a minor, small extent, some monetary savings in air pollution. So this is an interesting finding, because as I said before, most of the time we tend to compare business or reference scenarios with ambitious energy efficiency scenarios, which then leads to some very compelling numbers that help make a case for energy efficiency. However, what we found in this report is that when we look at a 2050 net zero greenhouse gas emissions target, these multiple impacts may not be as significant as we always suppose, because many of these impacts that we often call multiple benefits of energy efficiency also arise to renewable energy generation, including employment gains, including, which is now super relevant, energy security, including air pollution as well. So that's why, unfortunately, we didn't have enough funding for this task in order to go further. There've been efforts in other projects though. But a very critical issue for future research would be to look at how significant multiple impacts of energy efficiency actually are in this net zero greenhouse gas emissions context by 2050. Here on the right-hand side, you see some quantitative numbers on these air pollution impacts. And basically, the critical numbers are here at the bottom right-hand side. So these are the total damage costs in terms of biodiversity losses, crop damage, health damage, material damage, for the three scenarios, and they only differ by like a digit or something. So what we concluded here is that air pollution impacts in this net zero context are not super significant, and the same may hold for other multiple impacts, which from my personal point of view allows for a conclusion that multiple impacts may not be the total game changer if we really were to take the 2050 target seriously. So here are some final conclusions. So as I pointed out earlier, solving this trade-off between system resources implies a fair comparison that is not simply limited to financial costs and benefits as we used to in the past, but also to include these intangible social environmental effects in the form of multiple impacts, no matter how significant each and every of them is. Also, what I've shown is that assessing these relative merits of resource options in impact assessments, infrastructure investment, public funding decisions, etc., requires some form of aggregation of multiple impacts. Options include CBA, MCA, and some miscellaneous frameworks. However, each of these frameworks has some critical limitations, and probably they cannot, or in the end, they most likely won't be able to replace human judgment in different decision contexts. It's a kind of interesting development that is going on right now with this energy efficiency first principle in the EU legislation, and I'm very curious to see the final outcome of the EED once it's gone through the trilogue negotiations. But apparently the Commission seems to be super confident about the fact that you can really have these rational quantifications of costs and benefits and put everything together and then have kind of a rational decision between resource options in order to really make the best of every investment decision that is to make in the EU energy system. But me personally, I'm a little skeptical about this based on our research in the project. But let's see how this goes. Right, that's the overall story I wanted to tell. Happy to take any questions and to discuss this further. Thanks.
Thank you. Question? Yeah.
Hi, very good presentation, and you saw me nodding my head.
Yeah,
I did. I work in America, and we've been trying to quantify. We call them non-energy impacts, and haven't had too much success. So you're in good hands. Don't feel bad. But I was wondering, have you ever looked at other health impacts? Like, for example, I did a study with one of the utilities in Chicago, and they were looking at the improvements from the effects of weather. And how if you I know I'm going crazy. If you build improvements in low-income housing, like multifamily housing, does that reduce the impacts of weather in Chicago? Which I don't know if you're familiar. Chicago has terrible winters and really hot summers, so it's just it's a weather challenge. So we're actually trying to quantify them. I keep saying it's not going to be measurable. Maybe I'm wrong. So, but go ahead.
Thank you. It's a super critical topic indeed, and in the EU there's this ongoing debate or this ongoing issue of energy poverty in many countries, which with the unfortunate cases of winter mortality in different countries as a result of cold weather. That being said, I'm I am aware of research that has been dealing with this, and also as part of the NFIRST project, we tried to quantify the effect of building retrofits on perceived thermal comfort. However, what we did not manage in the project was to provide some monetization of these impacts, which of course leads to all these ethical concerns that surround it, which makes it super difficult. And I feel like this is still kind of an empty space in the literature on if we really want to put a price tag on these human lives in that context, in the context of investments and in the context of decision making. But overall, yeah, it's a super critical aspect, and I suppose if you were to quantify or if you had a monetary estimate of these lives saved, let's say, or also of reduced morbidity and reduced illnesses and other impediments, then probably the perceived value for energy efficiency would further increase, and you could make a stronger case for energy efficiency. But yeah, it's still really challenging to factor this in. Like here, we picked the case of air pollution impacts because the research has been there for, I don't know, 4 decades at least. There's emission factors and cost rates that are readily available. Of course, there's always some uncertainty around these cost rates that are being used, but it makes it a little easier to include them in these cost-benefit analysis. But yeah, it's definitely a critical thing to deal with now.
Yes, I know some study in UK or in France that monetize the effect of energy efficiency of retrofit of building on health and the money savings from the health system. Yeah. So it's because to be health cost to the society, to the health system. No? So there are some studies that monetize the effect of energy efficiency on buildings.
Yeah, I also tried to push this a little in the NFIRST project, but then our project partners were a little reluctant with these monetizations and a little skeptical about it, and then in the end it didn't materialize. But yeah, it's definitely something to look into in the future.
Remember, the study was tricky.
Yeah.
Question? Hi, thanks. Very interesting. My name is Joel Franklin from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, and have worked for a long time in transport in Sweden. And there is a very strong tradition of cost-benefit analysis, monetizing a lot of the things that you might wonder how they can be monetized. But it is done, and it's a widespread practice in transport of using cost-benefit analysis. And I think my experience with it is that the biggest problems with either cost-benefit analysis or multi-criteria analysis is transparency and consistency. With either, there's big issues, and you're making a lot of implicit assumptions and valuations in multi-criteria analysis if you don't if you're not very, very careful. But I wonder, I guess coming to a question about this, there's also an issue of consistency. If one domain, transport, and another domain, energy, is doing things very differently, making assumptions about valuations using their own background. So I wonder, is there any opportunity here to try to harmonize things across sectors so that we don't start doing things very differently in one, coming up with policy advice in one area that's based on a completely different set of assumptions from the assumptions in another policy area, generating its own policy advice? And there seems to be a lot of dangers there as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I would totally agree that harmonization of the CBA or MTA or whatever approach is super challenging. And I think the European Commission, like the way it embarked on now, is kind of facing this challenge pretty soon, because they wrote all these sections on cost-benefit analysis in this proposal for the ED recast, etc. So they're gonna have to deal with this at some point, and I'm pretty sure that they're gonna come up with some dedicated guidelines on what they actually mean with these cost-benefit methodologies and how they're supposed to be designed, etc. at some point in the future, which then will of course involve the work of us as evaluators and researchers, etc. But Yeah, it's hard to say. Like on the one hand, you want to make these guidelines as general as possible in order to be applicable across sectors, not only buildings but also transportation, industry, etc. But on the other hand, as you said, there are some particularities to every multiple impacts, and if you really wanted to be super transparent about everything, then this would probably go beyond the usual frame of these commission guidelines that accompany new EU legislation. So yeah, I'm very curious about this, like how this is going to turn out in practice. Like as I said before, like my personal sentiment is that this whole rational decision making may be a little I don't know, maybe we're putting a little bit too much faith into this at the EU level overall, because we like, as we also discussed in multiple instances today, we cannot always factor in all uncertainties that are around. We do not always have the best data available, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, looking forward to see how this goes. Yeah.
Another question? Yeah.
Yes, hello. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, in terms of like concepts, in what way this multiple benefits framework relates to another framework that has a similar kind of visual, which is a well-being framework. I don't know if you're familiar with it, like the likes of Kate Rayworth really present these kinds of frameworks that are also used in decision making. I've done some work on how different countries use these well-being frameworks to make decisions on policy or evaluate policy. And one thing that struck me is that most of these frameworks are not intended to standardize, and they're not intended to sort of aggregate all its data. It's just to make transparent what the impacts are on different fields that have to do with well-being. And I was wondering if you're familiar with that, and to what extent that sort of differs or corresponds to the use and the function of a multiple benefits framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to be honest, I haven't yet stumbled across the well-being framework, but I'd be very happy to catch up on that. But as regards the multiple impacts concept, as I now framed it, it's not really a concept yet. Like if you pick 10 different publications or reports on multiple impacts and multiple benefits, you're going to have at least 10 different classifications on what the relevant multiple impacts are. In many cases, there's kind of a collection of what is considered as relevant impacts, but then it already starts with the evaluation perspective, like whether I look at a single building owner or a society at large, you're going to end up with different classifications of multiple impacts. So even though there has been quite some research, including academic papers, etc., on multiple impacts, I feel like there's still the need for a kind of overarching, consistent, theoretically substantiated concept that would be kind of in line with the well-being concept that you just mentioned there.
So thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. If I understood correctly, this program, Energy Efficiency First, was launched in 2018, right? So you've been looking at how many years? 2019 and 20, mainly trying to evaluate impacts stemming from it, right? So my question would be, wasn't it premature, or you think already based on this very early data, you were able to form views on benefits, on impacts? And the second question, if you came already across any negative impacts, especially as it was COVID during 2020, so a decrease of demand for energy. At the same time, this program promoted addition of energy, especially in solar and in wind, if I understood correctly, right? So increase of supply and decrease of demand. We came across this evaluating similar policies in other countries where there was suddenly a oversupply of energy and problems with with off-takers, creditworthiness as it was impossible to sell energy. So just wondering if you...
Yeah, maybe to begin with, this modeling that we conducted here is at a very high level. So this is like classic optimization modeling in which there's no dedicated policy instruments behind it that are kind of explaining these changes, but more a range of possible consistent futures that kind of depict what the future might look like and what implications this has. That being said, I feel like negative, or let's call them negative effects of energy efficiency are not always explicitly considered, both in the literature and the debate. For example, what has been a thing for years and still probably a major obstacle to energy efficiency is the huge transaction costs that are associated with the millions and millions of houses that would need to be renovated across the EU in order to reach these ambitious targets. I've stumbled across some literature that says that if you were to monetize these transaction costs for getting in touch with contractors to deal with all this time hassle that is associated with the building retrofit, you would end up at about a 20% markup on the initial investment of the building retrofit. Like this is like a high upper estimate, but it kind of illustrates that also energy efficiency comes with specific negative multiple impacts that we sometimes tend to neglect or tend to avoid also in the debate, and this makes it also important to factor in these effects in whatever decision support framework you use, be it MCA or CBA or whatever, in order to really have this fair comparison between different resource options. I hope this answers your second question in some way. Would you be so kind to briefly recap your first question? I'm not sure if I got it correctly.
Yeah. Whether the data, if this regulation or this program, energy efficiency effects,
Yeah.
2018,
Mm-hmm.
Probably your data would come from 19.
Mm-hmm.
Too short, isn't it? Don't you think it's too short to inform you on how it will? Just in our evaluations, and we tend to wait. You know, to see what is the broader impact on systems, on systems, EU, I guess, in France,
Okay.
let's say renewables,
Mm.
and we increase supply of energy. They have lots of nuclear. It's not easy to turn off.
Okay. Yeah.
So you have huge oversupply of energy.
Mm-hmm.
But you can see this effect, this impact, in the longer term.
Mm.
This accumulates, aggregates, and you have the data to evaluate properly.
Yeah. Maybe my short answer to this question would be that basically we don't have enough time to wait to really have quantitative evidence on what are the best resources, because the investments that are being now most likely to be in place until 2050, if they are not fossil generators and they are decommissioned because of rising CO2 prices and other things. But when it comes to gas network investment in particular, but also power network investments and district heating networks, these are all very long-lived infrastructures. So basically now we have to, even our evidence might be short-sighted, these investment decisions need to be made now. So that's why personally I do see some rationale for this energy efficiency first concept, because it at least makes this trade-off between saving and supplying energy more explicit in the debate. On the other hand, there's this whole challenge of that we basically do not know how exactly the future is going to evolve, and then perhaps in 2050 we're going to find out, okay, maybe these these indoor comfort gains as a result of thermal retrofits were completely overestimated in these quantitative assessments that we made in 2020. But yeah, it's the dilemma we have to deal with, I guess. But yeah, hope that answers your question.
So thank you again. Oh, a question? Yes, the last one.
Very brief one as well. And very basic. It's two, but very basic questions. So coming from the renewable side, first of all, thank you very much, Tim. Coming from the renewable side, I've still a little bit of difficulties to understand these concepts. So first of all, my question is, so when you talk about the CBAs, so on which level are they actually conducted? Is it governments who try to, when they start introducing a new scheme, to see should we put up an energy efficiency scheme for that industry or rather for households? Is it on that level? Maybe I think that's a short one.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, there are, as I've shown tried to show in another slide, there are all these different instances where these decision support frameworks could play a role. Impact assessments are one of them. What's now happening when the Commission conducts these impact assessments is that they calculate a range of scenarios. They attach a monetary value to them. They evaluate some of these multiple impacts in qualitative or semi-quantitative terms. And then in the end, they make kind of from my perspective, a semi-transparent selection of the most beneficial pathway and make this a preferred policy option. So it's not like the most sophisticated approach to deal with uncertainties and to deal with multiple impacts, etc. But this is one way where one example where this is relevant. Another is power and gas transmission network planning. So these EU-wide or the national regulatory authorities, of course, they have regulatory oversight over some rough regulatory oversight about the investments that are being made by the TSOs and DSOs, and these TSOs and DSOs, they are encouraged to use these harmonized CBA and MCA methodologies that have been developed by ENSO-E and ENSO-G for the EU as a whole. And when you look into these guidelines, it's kind of a mix of a CBA approach involving all these financial costs that are easily quantifiable, plus some more difficult to quantify impacts, which are then kind of put together in a multi-criteria analysis in the end in these guidelines, which is also a way to deal with that. You monetize some things and you leave some other stuff in physical quantitative terms, and then you put it together in an MCA. But that already illustrates that there's not a silver bullet for having like as I also mentioned before, you probably won't be able to have a harmonized CBA or MCA framework that is applicable to each and every major investment case in the EU, but you always have to deal with the specifics of each and every decision that there is to be made. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. No, thanks. So rather on the higher level. And
yeah, totally.
Lastly, maybe very shortly, for me, it's a little bit far away, these multiple benefits in the renewable energy realm, I would say. We have these secondary objectives. In some countries, they are more important, in others, it's not that important, like local economic development, job creation, and so on and so forth. But we don't really look at them when we talk about renewables. Why are they? Because when I hear the energy efficiency people talking multiple benefits, always where does the difference come from? Like, could you, maybe that's a rather philosophical question, if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Super good question. I've also been wondering, like when writing these reports and stuff, why it's so prominent in the energy efficiency sphere. And my personal, from my perspective, I guess it's because energy efficiency never really took off. Like according to the potentials that have already been shown like 2 decades ago by various researchers, and we're kind of still lagging behind with all these political ambitions for energy efficiency. And in the beginning, the whole debate was mostly framed in monetary terms, like beginning with the oil crisis in the 70s and arguing, okay, we can definitely save costs if we were to go for energy efficiency. And that went on until the 2010 years, and only up until a couple of years ago, this This debate, which has been more present in the US context for a longer time, finally came over to Europe, and along with the idea that the benefits of energy efficiency are not limited to mere financial savings for the individual building owner or company owner or whatever, but that they go beyond these things, including impact for the individual decision makers, such as thermal comfort, but also gains for society as a whole, and such as reduced air pollution, etc. I believe overall it's kind of a way to push the topic and to keep it relevant in the debate, because I wouldn't be surprised if some people were frustrated with the kind of limited progress on energy efficiency over the last decades that is kind of in contrast to the big promises that were made 2 decades ago, for example. So yeah, that might be one way to shape the debate and the discourse, I guess.
Okay, thank you again.
Enough from my side.
So our last speaker is Björn Edin from University of Edinburgh. Put your presentation here. You are here. J'ai compris. Okay. I don't know why there is a subtitle here. Yep, what's that? I'll try it again. It's weird. Okay. Now, add a note. Yeah, I think so. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon. So yeah, I'm gonna present a work in progress that we're doing at the University of Edinburgh. So we're working in the Energy Ref project. I have the title there in the top. There's a project that's been running since 2019. It's been delayed a bit due to COVID because we had issues carrying out workshops and in-person meetings and interviews and data collection. So basically what I'm going to present here is I'm going to present kind of the challenge that we have found in terms of developing a multi-criteria assessment that can assess smart local energy system projects in the UK. Kind of building on what kind of Tim had talked about earlier about multi-criteria assessments. So basically the context that I'm kind of talking about is that in the UK and all over the world, we have a push to smart and to bring forward smart and local energy systems. And there is a high push specifically in the UK now to bring forward strategies that enable and foster localized energy systems and often more digitalized energy systems where people can understand what is happening there. And therefore then take part in the facilitation of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy security and energy production. So that is kind of like one of the contexts that we have. And the other context that has kind of been also quite evident throughout the conversation today and in the meeting, it's quite a complex issue. We have, so the graph up in the corner over there, that's kind of just a simplified graph of the complexity of the stakeholders within the UK energy system and the concept we have. And then we have below that kind of talking about the complexity of an energy system. You have energy system on a national level, regional level, and urban level. You have different types of enablers which are around there, where you have the informations, you have the technologies, and then inside that you have the kind of the overall layers or the levels. And then we have some sort of an assessment tool and assessment criteria. And as has been kind of been talked about today, there's a plethora of them. There's a lot of assessment tools, a lot of criteria out there. And in the UK, specifically in relation to smart local energy systems, what the team that I'm on, we have kind of identified there isn't a clear way of how to assess a smart local energy system. So in the end, we don't really have assessment tool that can allow us to smart local energy system project to assess how they're doing or benchmark them against the previous work of where they're going. So basically, our research process basically been around 3 phases so far. So in the beginning, we did quite an extensive literature review and quite an extensive stakeholder engagement before COVID. We had 2 workshops where we used to kind of engage the stakeholders, because we wanted to make sure our model captured was what they wanted to be in the assessment model. We always talk about what policymakers want, and we talk about what companies want, but we often forget to talk about the users. So we took over quite a range of stakeholders, and what we came out from there were like, there are 3 or 6 key themes that we came out with. They were like, we need to have a business and economic metrics. We need to have data management metrics, because we're talking about smart digitalization of an energy system. We need to have a metric that has measure the technological performances. We need to have some people in living environment and governance. But then within inside all of them, we have 5 to 7 other types of next level metrics that makes the thing even more complicated. And that's where we kind of come into next. And after we kind of did that, and we kind of got to know what people wanted to have in our tool, we kind of realized that we wanted to know what we could do better. So then we had an expert semi-structured interview with experts. And what we kind of figured out there, we talked to 10 experts over about an hour and a half each interview, to kind of get an understanding of what they saw as the major challenges to kind of bring forward the concept that we had for our assessment model. And that kind of comes out that we ended up with quite a lot of challenges. So that's kind of what the analysis have kind of brought us. As I said earlier, we are developing a multi-criteria assessment tool. This research is basically just focusing on what's in the green spot over there, the problem structuring, and half of the part of the modeling development. And this is basically identifying the area of success and the corresponding metrics and indicators that go into the model. If I'm going to talk where we are now in the progress, we are here. So this is how far we've gone since we since we finished that area. So we are testing and refining the tool as we speak, and we're planning to carry out practical case studies later on this year. So basically, our key results are based around 3 major points. First one is basically stakeholder saturation. So because in the UK, like we had 100 people in the workshops, we had 10 people that we did, or 7 people that we did interview with, but it was a lot of people from the same organization, of the same people coming in. So we were experiencing, they were highlighting that specifically in the interviews, is that you need to have a strategy to minimize kind of like engagement with a certain set of stakeholders, because people get tired if you're constantly bombarding them with messages or asking them to do certain things. So that was one of the issues that we're dealing with, is we have already experienced some of that where people are not kind of engaged with us anymore because they feel like we've kind of been pushing them too much or asking too much of them. So that's one of the challenges we already kind of identified. Then, as has kind of been mentioned earlier today and kind of follow up on a previous kind of throughout the day, is that data collection is a challenge. Like either getting just good, valuable data can be a huge issue. And that has been one of our major challenges right now, trying to test them all, is to get relevant data or get data that's actually usable. But that also comes into, we have 60 indicators. Some of them are easy to quantify, some of them are not easy to quantify. And that is another challenge that we're kind of dealing with, is that we have either often quite a broad definition of, for example, what smart local energy system is a broad definition in a sense. And then we are also kind of missing in terms of that our indicators tend to be quite broad. So that's kind of what we've been using, kind of the engagement from the interviews and kind of the engagement we're doing now in refining our model is kind of getting more way of kind of maybe minimizing some of the indicators that we have. We have actually in some ways extended. So now I think we have 9 indicators in the governance section to kind of capture some of the aspects there to kind of minimize kind of the text hidden to kind of have a more clear definition of what we are asking for. And therefore, we are trying to reduce the miscommunication. So those are kind of our major issues. And yeah, like I said earlier, stakeholder burnout is something we've been experiencing, and that's basically means that we might have quite a lot of stakeholders on the table in the beginning, but now we're kind of ending up with maybe just one or two, because the other ones have been burned out, and also due to COVID, it was hard to get two people, so we were having some issues there. And then in terms of the data collection, so basically the figure on the right side of the presentation kind of shows you where we're standing. So basically, in terms of the environment, people are living and business economy, data collection is high, has a high impact, and it's kind of challenging because it's hard to get data on some of those aspects. And then we have medium, high in data and technical performances, because it's easier to get data on specific technologies and specific tools. That are used in any system, and then on governance, we have a low degree of challenges. And these are just kind of what people were mentioning in terms of getting some of the data collection issues. One of the experts talking that accessing specific data, for example, data X to capital and depth ratio may be difficult as it's commercially sensitive. So often we have issues with that. And then also the other one is about the environmental aspects. Often it's hard to get those specific challenges, but it's also often in some cases hard to quantify, and the same goes with people in living. And then like reliability is not an easy one to measure or get data about. So we are dealing with quite a lot of data collection issues due to the fact that we're trying to measure a lot of elements. And that's kind of what we are kind of realizing. So now, as I said earlier, we have started to reshape it, and we are doing some testing. So hopefully by the end of the month, end of this year, we have some outputs. And then the definitions, that's kind of the third challenge, is that, like I said earlier, we have broad definition for a certain amount of indicators. And we're asking people to kind of answer big questions. So for example, in the governance aspects, we are asking a question about redressing the consumers. So we're asking them not only about that element, but we're also asking about the transparency of decision making. And that's the problem. Like it's a broad aspect to ask questions about, and it's hard to have them specifically defined because we're trying to want to capture as much information as you needed. So that is one of the key problems that we are in terms of getting some data on certain issues to make it more clear what we're asking people to do. And also what we have also kind of realized that we might have to exclude certain criteria is also quite important. We don't need to measure some of them because maybe just getting data is not relevant. So in the testing aspect that we have now is we also allow the people that are testing to kind of say, this is not relevant to me when they're testing the model. So then that allows the project to kind of exclude the criteria that they don't want to include. So basically, this is what the model is expecting to focus on, and kind of just to give a pretty broad overview of what the model is supposed to be about, or what we're trying to do, is we're trying to allow the smart local energy system project to understand is how far they're to achieve a certain project. So let's say you want to have an energy system that is quite robust. You want to have a high robustness in your system. You start maybe saying right now, based on what is in your system, you might have a level 2 robustness. And then you want to get to 5. Let's say that's the criteria. You will get a percentage of how far you are to achieving that for each indicator that we're measuring based on the data that you provide to us currently. And then what we then have is that you can run the model. In the beginning, you will get some sort of an objective, and then every time you would run the assessment model, you will be able to measure how close you are to achieving your objective. So basically, in the end, it's a tool for smart local energy system projects to understand their progress and kind of visualize how far they're from achieving their set goals. So as I said earlier, we are in the states of redefining them and developing a practical application. And we are hopefully by end of this year, probably earlier, trying to run some case studies. So yeah, I think that is basically it for me. Yeah, if you want to know anything more about what we're doing, just go on the EnergyRef webpage. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions now or in emails. So thanks.
So questions? No, we are all tired now.
Yes, thanks for taking us through all the challenges that you came across in this project. The things that you mentioned about what are the major challenges in using this model, they sound very familiar to what I found in a completely different context, but it was like evidence-based policy making and implementation. Where stakeholders were supposed to contribute to discussions on best available techniques with their data and so on and so forth, and especially those challenges regarding completeness of the data, reliability of the data, accessibility of the data, they really came up in what I also researched. Now, my question is, first of all, what does this say about the value of, so the challenges that you encounter, what does it say about the value of this model and using it in practice? And more broadly, perhaps, what does it say about the ambition of this kind of evidence-based decision making or policy making? Is it feasible?
Feasible, yeah. Answering the question about using the tool and the challenges, and if it's practical, if you get say people's interest in using it. If you talk to a smart local energy system project, they are quite interested in helping us. But then they can hit a lot of barriers in sharing data with us because they might not be able to share some sort of consumption data because that is then forbidden by the industry to share an industrial data, or they might not be able to share other parts of data because they're under an NDA. So that is another one, because most of the small communities that we talked about, we've been working a bit with Orkney in the northern part of Scotland, the Orkney Islands, and they have been quite generous in helping us in their project Reflex to providing us with data. But they have also said, there are some data we can't give you. We want to give it to you, but we can't because we even don't have access. We can't allowed to share them. So that are kind of the barriers. Most of the small projects that we talk to see the benefits of it. They also see that it often requires a lot of work from them. So that's the other aspect. The man hours that people have to provide us with data is another issue. Because they are all willing and all helpful. We want this because they can also help us to maybe, if we have a tool, they can say for benchmarking, they can see how they're doing and how they're getting forward and achieving their goals. They have better way of selling that to an investor, better way of selling that to a policymaker. They can sell, this is what we are making, this is what we're creating, this is what we can be potentially gaining in benefits for the local community. But then they might not only have one person that can work half a day, provide us with data. So they also rely on fundings for their projects. So that's it. There's a, how to say it, there's a kind of a cause of effect of challenges that are built from limited time and also money available to provide us with data. Then there are other challenges due to regulatory work and where you get the data. In terms of factual-based decision making, I would say it's somewhat needed. It's somewhat needed to provide some facts because often we see politics of looking at for policymakers, it's often political driven. They often make decisions based on, I would say, ideology. They're not really looking at what are the facts. I think if you look at the UK right now, they're putting from a new budget. I don't know, the math there doesn't really make sense if you look at it. And that's often just because that's an ideology idea that they're running from some economic concept that they believe in. But if you really just go and look at the nitty gritty, just do the calculations, you would see that the facts do not line with what they're trying to say. Like, I don't really want to bring in politics, but that's kind of what like is the issue. Like, we need some sort of a fact to guide politicians and our policymakers to move us towards achieving what we need to achieve, which is basically a cleaner planet or like a cleaner energy system. So yeah, did I answer the questions?
Hey, you did. I was just wondering if you take all the challenges into consideration and you say we're in need of facts for decision making, but can we speak of facts being provided to policy making or whatever decision making if these data and all these problems compromise the facts? I mean, if you have such a small share and such a random share of the facts, are we even talking about facts?
No, I think that is another issue. Like, we need to might be also just include more transparency. Like, if you're looking at, because if you want, like, we need so much data to be able to calculate a lot of these problems. It doesn't matter if you're looking at it from a small local energy system point of view or a national point of view. You need a lot of data. And if data is being blocked by regulations or lack of transparency, of course it is skewed. Like, data is going to be skewed. Data is not going to give you a clear picture. So we need to find a way to somehow solve that. I don't know if you do that through regulations or just saying, like, for research purposes or policy-making purposes, these data are just available. And then everybody who does research just sign an NDA, and then the research will be publicly available. But I also think maybe this information needs to be publicly available. Maybe you just need to allow the public to see that data so they can make decisions on their own as well. Like, that is also an idea. That might be too radical, but I think that might make sense in some ways as well.
No more question? No. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Sorry.